today's last session on the second day of this year's Inocracy Conference. It's great to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to an exciting, approximately 1 hour. Our session tonight is called Beyond Humanism, Looking at the Future Through the Ecological Lens. We all know about the scope and the danger of the climate crisis. I think you all heard the facts and know about them. Maybe, like me, you're tired of listening to them over and over again. And all the more we should ask ourselves, why is there such a dissonance between what we know and what we do? Why do we continue to treat the climate crisis in mainstream political discourse as a future problem instead of a crisis that is happening already full force? And why do we treat it primarily as a crisis of human civilization instead of a crisis of life itself? The longer I sit with these questions, the more it comes to my mind that maybe if we want to tackle the climate crisis on a more fundamental level, we must transform the perspective we have on ourselves as humanity and on the systems we build and we live in every day. And in this following session, we will explore into this whole field of very fundamental questions. And I'm very delighted to have 4 distinguished guests in this session, 2 of which are with me for the first part of this session now. Both are thinkers and doers in the fight against the climate crisis. Both are at home in the Western world and the Eastern world, which makes it very special to welcome both of them here as guests. And I want to start with welcoming Amitav Ghosh. Amitav is a well-known writer, the author of 9 novels, most recently Gun Island, which I read with great joy. And as importantly, and maybe more importantly for today, he's the writer of important non-fiction books, most notably The Great Derangement, Climate Crisis, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, which is a book that really made me rethink how I think about the climate crisis and the fallout it produces for humanity and life on this planet. He was awarded many awards and honors for his writings, and he lives in New York City today as a professor in comparative literature at Queen's College, and he was born in Calcutta in India. Amitav, it's a great pleasure to welcome you at Inocracy 2020. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, but it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me. But let me just correct one little detail and say I'm not a professor and I'm not with any university.
Okay, thank you for pointing this out. I researched this online. I'm going to send you the source. Our second
you can't trust the net.
Yes, that's true. Our second guest tonight is Malini Mehra. She's CEO of Globe International, which is an acronym for Global Legislators Organization for a Balanced Environment. Malini has a long and distinguished career in civil society, in business, and also in political institutions. Among many honors, she's a fellow of the RSA, one of our conference partners. And like Amitav, she's an Indian citizen, and today she is based in London after having lived basically all over the world. Malini, it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight.
Fantastic, Hannah. Thank you so much.
Sure. So let's kick off this conversation, and we agreed on speaking about 2 main issues over the coming 20 minutes or so. And it's going to be challenging to cover both of them, but let's try at least. So first I would like to talk with you about how we can expand our perspective on the climate crisis and what it does with us as humanity. And also I would like to talk about how we must transform our democratic institutions to tackle the climate crisis more effectively and meaningfully than we do today. And I would like to start with the first topic. And would like to start by saying that one of the things I find very disturbing when it comes to mainstream, at least European discourse on the climate crisis today, is that people still continue to talk about it as if it was an abstract threat, something we have to deal with in the future and which is really detached from the present and from ourselves. And I would like to ask both of you, and maybe starting with you, Amitav, what do you believe is the root of this mindset and the attitude it produces?
Well, thank you, Anna. I think the first thing that we have to recognize over there is that, it's because of the way that the news about the climate crisis has come to us. It comes to us completely framed by what you might call Western credentialed experts, almost all of whom are based in universities in the global north. But it's, scientists are not the only people who've known that something is changing dramatically in the world for a long time. You ask women who have to walk further and further to fetch water. You ask fishermen who see their fish catches disappearing. You ask farmers who are dealing with unprecedented droughts. They all know. Unfortunately, however, their voices never get represented, in this debate. So, one of the reasons why this has come to us, why people think of this as an abstract problem, is simply the way that the news has come to us. Secondly, it's because of the way that climate scientists formulate their work, which is always in relation to a projection in the future. There again, that also makes it seem very abstracted, very distant. Whereas we know now that these impacts are all around us. They're everywhere around us.
Yeah. Malini, what's your take on this? I mean, why doesn't it seem more immediate? Why are we not able to speak about this in terms that actually show that we are in the middle of this already?
I'm not sure if I agree entirely with the premise that people still see climate change as a tomorrow problem instead of as a today problem. I think that the level of abstraction that we had in the discourse, maybe pre-Paris, before 2015, it was abstract. It was couched in terms of this is going to be some problem in the future, not the problem of today. But the last couple of years have profoundly changed the way in which climate change is being talked about, how it's communicated, how the media reports on it. And I think primarily it's because we are seeing the impacts of climate change on our screens. They are being referred to in the context of climate impacts, whether it's drought, fires, floods around the world. So I think that not in the same situation now as we were in the past in our understanding of the climate change threat being a current threat. And I think this is borne out by also a number of the most recent surveys and polls. Yale University does a very regular poll around the world, but also in the US, of public perceptions of climate risk. And there is a very high degree of sensitivity in the US now, especially after the droughts and the Californian fires, to climate change being an existential crisis. You remember just a couple of years ago, you had the town of Paradise, which was caught up in an inferno in California. So, I'm not sure I agree entirely with the premise. I would challenge it.
Okay. If I follow up on that, do you feel that there's something like an empathy gap, knowing that the global south is hit a lot harder by today's fallout of the climate crisis, but the north is, let's say, more excluded from it?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm following up on Malini.
Ah.
Yeah, again, I don't think in terms of North and South. That's not my worldview. It's not my perspective. Certainly, there is huge empathy around the world for those people who are the victims of phenomena such as climate change. And the victims are always the poor. They're always the vulnerable. So I think in any society, and don't necessarily need graphic terms of North, South, or East or West, that there can be barriers to empathizing with the vulnerable, but those are not determined by geographical boundaries. Those are societal boundaries. So I'm sure I can find as many people in India who are impervious to the suffering of the poor, especially along the coast, who have been ravaged by, storm after, as I will to find people, who are dispassionate about climate change and its impacts on farmers in France, for example.
Yeah. What is your perspective on that, Amitav?
Let me say that I agree with Manisha that I think we crossed some sort of boundary in 2018, where to people, especially in the West and in the North, they recognize that the climate crisis is really upon them. But here is the problem. This problem is not for the West to solve anymore. All our discourses about it sort of are conducted within a frame where we think that America and Europe can solve this problem, but that's not really possible anymore. It's really in the non-Western world that it has to be tackled. In China, in India, in Indonesia, in Africa, you need the support and understanding of those populations. And I'm sorry to say, I don't think that that same degree of awareness exists in any of those countries. It doesn't really matter that much in China, because in China the government is very proactive. But in relation to India, in India, I would say there's very little awareness of how climate is affecting the world. Secondly, let me say that I think the way the climate crisis is playing out is actually not very simply reducible to poor versus rich or whatever. I mean, you look at the parts of the world that have been absolutely devastated in these last few couple of years. California. You look at Houston. It's the fourth largest city in America, the hub of the global petroleum trade. You look at parts of Italy. I would say that there are many parts of Europe that are actually very badly affected by climate change. So I don't think it's necessarily a sort of, rich region versus poor region. In fact, I think it's going to play out a lot more like the pandemic, where countries like Vietnam have been extraordinarily successful in controlling the pandemic. And it's actually many rich countries that have succumbed.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mention the COVID crisis and how it's being governed, basically. Malini, do you feel that there is something to discover in this moment in the COVID crisis which may help us tackle the climate crisis in the mid and long term?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I just want to say that I do agree with Amitav that simple dichotomies of the rich being protected and the poor being vulnerable just don't hold water. And absolutely right, giving the example of California, which is the fifth largest economy in the planet and has been brought to its knees by wildfires and drought. Australia, I mean, you can go on and cite examples of where industrialized countries have been really affected badly by climate change. In terms of the COVID pandemic, I want to refer to, we have this global framework for disaster risk reduction. All countries were required by the Hyogo International Process on Disaster Risk Reduction. And, the Sendai Framework, which is this major international agreement, which was adopted by every government in 2015, along with the Paris Agreement. Now, what did they require of governments? They required them to have in place proper disaster risk reduction strategies when it came to all sorts of threats, including biophysical threats such as pandemics. Now, most countries didn't invest in those kind of institutional responses. And so here we are, where the countries which responded best to the COVID crisis were those in East Asia and in Africa, who had the experience previously of having to deal with epidemiological breakouts, of SARS and Ebola, etc., and invested in the public health systems and in the frameworks. Now, investment in preparedness really makes a difference. And so that's why if we're talking about the link between the two, we have to have a sensible approach to risk governance, which is why the lesson from the UN now in the context of COVID is please don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We have all of the scenarios we could hope for. We have all of the guidance. We need governments to now take it on board and begin adopting proper strategies for dealing with mass emergencies, because we will see COVID is just a dress rehearsal for the mass emergencies that will be as a result of climate impacts the world over. So we better get prepared.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Also because it really builds a bridge into our second focus topic. One of the reasons why so many people lose trust in the democratic process and democracy itself right now is that the institutions of democracy do not deliver the results we need when it comes to tackling existential challenges like the climate crisis. So when you look at global and national governance and how we organize it today, what do you believe are the core shifts we must master over the coming years? And I would like to start with you in this, Amitav.
Look, I think the single most important factor, as we can see now, is inequality. Again, I think the pandemic shows us that inequality is the factor which really creates the worst possible outcome. Look at the countries that are worst affected: the US, Brazil, India. All three countries really marked by extreme inequalities. So that's one thing. And I think it's very important to look at this pandemic, just as Manisha was saying, in terms of future impacts of climate change, because of course, climate change and COVID-19 are not causally related, but they are cognate in the sense that both are part of a general accelerationism in the world, and that is the real problem, this accelerationism. So the impacts are going to unfold in the same way. And we can see now that really one of the things that's most necessary is social trust. It's even more necessary than just democratic governance. It's where people trust their leaders that they've been able to come through. So, for example, New Zealand, similarly, Taiwan, people in Vietnam may not necessarily love their government, but they, on the whole, believe that the government is doing something which is reasonable. Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is a deeply divided country, but Sri Lanka has come through this incredibly well. Why? Because past experience also helps. I think the idea that people have had for a long time that affluence, institutions necessarily protect a country, these are completely mistaken ideas which come down to us from the Holocene period, and they don't really apply to what lies ahead. I think in many ways you can see that affluence and advanced infrastructure actually create many kinds of vulnerability in itself. Just imagine, it's so easy for food distribution systems in Europe and America to break down, simply because they're so complex. Complexity is itself a problem.
Yeah, Malini, what are your thoughts? I mean, you think and work so much on governance and its structures and how they can be or must be redone.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that encourage me and a few things that discourage me. So let me start with the bad news first. So if we look at, the Bennett Institute, the Center for Future Democracy at the University of Cambridge, has just come out with a survey. It's the largest survey of its type ever done, looking at the generational shift in faith in democracy. And there has been a real hollowing out of faith in democracy amongst millennials and Generation Z. That's really deeply worrying because, of course, it's the younger generation which most devastatingly impacted by COVID in terms of loss of education, loss of employment, anxiety about the future, a future in which all they hear about is, the death of nature, runaway climate, and they're losing faith in our democratic institutions. We have to claw that faith back. We are in a period of necessary transformation and renewal of our democratic systems. I think one of the points that Amitav touched on is extremely important, and that is, if you look across the board, those which have done well in the COVID pandemic response, it is largely high trust societies. So Taiwan, Korea, New Zealand, South Korea rather, Amitav is through the list very well. Sierra Leone also, many countries in Africa, which, as I mentioned earlier, invested in public health systems. Now, high trust societies are on the decline, and we have to look at how we can build trust, in particular, in highly diverse, heterogeneous societies. Look at the US, for example. If you were to do polls in the US in terms of confidence in public institutions, they would divide sharply along party political lines. The Democrats believe in climate change. They believe in COVID as a dangerous pandemic. The Republicans don't. So we've got a lot of polarities to bring together. And that's why, I think the word of the decade really is going to be radical transformation, whether it's to attend to the emergency of the climate or the nature emergency. We have to come up with really radical solutions, and there is hope. So let me say where there is hope. I'm really intrigued by how this period of dormancy, for so many of us, the lockdown period, has resulted in a really significant number of political startups around the world. People who are looking, just as you're doing, Hannah, with Inocracy. We're looking at what's worked in the past, what's failed, and how can we renew our policies. If you look at, there are new political forces also. Nationalism, we may have actually turned the corner on that. Populists are not being voted into office again. And populists, when they are in office, are doing things which are really quite unusual. Rodrigo Duterte, for example, the president of the Philippines, who's not seen as a friend of climate action, they have just announced a moratorium on new coal, ending their reliance on coal. We've got, the green wave, which has taken place all across Europe. I mean, in France, it's astonishing, just in the June regional elections, you had something like, I don't know, some of the major town halls in the country, which are taken over by green parties. So, there's a real wave, you can tell, of popular pressure for change. And I feel encouraged by that.
It's good to hear. And it really links to one session we had yesterday with Otto Sharma and Nipun Mehta, where we spoke about how architectures of separation need to be replaced with architectures of connectedness, basically. And we had one seed question in this session, which I would like to ask you as well, Amitav. It's a very simple question, but I think it's an important one. What gives you hope in today's situation?
Look, let's not be over optimistic. I think it's very hard to be Pollyanna-ish right now, because certainly in India, what we see with the present government is that there's a sort of, rivers of greenwashing rhetoric under which they're loosening all kinds of environmental regulations. We see the same in Brazil. We see the same right now in the United States. So it's very difficult to be Pollyanna-ish, if you like. At the same time, I do feel that, what gives me hope is really the young people, the movements of, say, someone like Greta Thunberg. She's galvanized so many people. And the movements of indigenous peoples. The No Dakota pipeline, I think that was an amazing movement. And these movements, if they can spur a global kind of a trend of, how shall I say, of non-cooperation, of civil disobedience or whatever, I think that could be one way forward. Certainly, I can't see much hope in institutional politics.
Okay. I would love to follow up on this, and we will do that with Ann Pettifor and Matthew Taylor in the reflection on our conversation. Before we go there, I would like to thank both of you for being here and for joining us tonight, and just, shedding your perspectives on these difficult questions we are trying to tackle. And all of those who watch and who are part of this as participants of this conference, I would like to invite you to join the breakout groups, which will last 15 minutes again. And after asking what gives you hope yesterday, I'm going for a more specific question tonight, which is, what do you think? Which transformative reforms of today's democratic institutions does the climate crisis ask for? Please fire your opinions and ideas in the chat. We will try to include this in the reflection session we will be having in 15 minutes. So thank you both for being here. I really enjoyed talking to you. It was an honor. And enjoy the breakout groups, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you all for having me. I'm afraid I have to go now, but thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. And thanks for staying with us for today's last reflection session. I'm really happy to welcome back Malini Mehra. Thanks for staying and thanks for being online again. And also I'm really glad that two new speakers joined us for this session, and I'm welcoming Ann Pettifor. Ann is a political economist and expert on financial systems. She's director of PRIME, which is an acronym for Policy Research in Macroeconomics. And famously, she recently published the book, The Case for the New Green Deal, an idea and a program she has been pushing for more than 10 years now. And I really believe she helped shape the global discourse on radical reform. Welcome, Ann.
Hi.
And also, I would like to welcome Matthew Taylor. Matthew is Chief Executive of the RSA, one of our conference partners. Matthew has extensive experience in the political sector. He worked for the British government under Tony Blair especially, and amongst other roles, he was chief advisor on strategy. Today, he heads the RSA, and also he's a writer, speaker, and an extremely fervent blogger. I don't think I know anyone who has blogged so much. I really respect that. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. It's quantity, not quality, that matters.
Yes, of course. That's why I mentioned it. Yeah. Thank you all for being here and for staying with us for the reflection session. I would frankly just like to ask both of you, Ann and Matthew, which reactions, which thoughts, maybe which feelings came up when you listened to Malini and Amitav speaking for the first 20 minutes. And Ann, I would like to start with you. What are your first reflections on what you heard?
So I was very struck by Amitav's remark about the nature of Western science and of how abstract it is, and about how it thinks always in relation to a projection into the future, and is not in a sense present in the way that a peasant woman having to work further for water is in the present, is in the crisis, or fishermen searching for fish, or farmers facing drought, and so on. But what I found interesting about their discussion was the debate around whether this was a North-South issue, whether the North could help the South, whether the South had to take its own initiative, whether it was an East-West issue. And I saw Malini pushing back against the idea of these divisions. And I'm with her in a way, but also I think, for me, the missing point was that actually the global economy is globalized. We live within a globalization framework, and it is a framework in which markets are, as Professor Quinn Slobodian argued, encased. They're protected from democracy. They are, if you like, detached from democracy very, very deliberately, detached from democratic governments and from the intervention of governments, and operate in a sense apart from. So we're governed largely, the economies are largely governed by financial markets, which literally do operate within the global sphere and without often any direct relationship to states or governments. And it's that, it seems to me, which makes us feel helpless, which rightly makes us think that our democracies are of no use at all. If we're being governed by markets, why vote for governments, basically? If governments have handed over to markets the task, for example, of tackling the pandemic here in Britain. The pandemic here in Britain is being managed by the private sector, by companies who've been given enormous contracts by the state to do this, aside from the state and aside from the collective efforts of the state. So I think that leads to the disillusionment in democracy, which both the speakers addressed. But I think what I'm coming back to is that we have to have a global solution to the fact that we're governed by global markets. And when we deal with that, we will be able to restore autonomy to governments so that they can act to protect the interests of their people. I have family in Vietnam, and I've watched as Vietnam has very systematically addressed this pandemic crisis and protected its citizens and its economy from that crisis in a way that the British government, which is an incredibly sort of liberalized government, which doesn't believe in testing passengers coming into the country or passengers leaving the country, that really believes that the market can solve this problem, has found itself really unable to deal with this pandemic. So we need governments and states and democracies need a degree of policy autonomy, which is denied to us by a globalized system, globalized financial, and I think that's what we should tackle.
Yeah, great. So this really expands the perspective, I think. So we do not only ask how must we transform democratic institutions, but also how must we democratize institutions like the market, which are not really under the public hand right now. I think that's a super relevant point. Matthew, I would like to follow up with you. What were your thoughts and reflections when you listened to the first part of this session?
Well, like Anne, I think that it was incredibly valuable to be taken out of the kind of Eurocentric perspective that I relapsed into most of the time, and to be reminded, as Amitav said, that this is no longer a problem the West can solve itself, and that in certain ways, the way in which we view this through European or Western eyes is part of the problem. But I also, like Anne, I found that it was in the discourse between Amitav and Malini that really kind of touched me. And that is that, in a sense, what I sensed, and Malini will come in and tell me whether I got this wrong, is that in a sense, Amitav's perspective, and by the way, The Great Derangement, if you haven't read it, is a fantastic work. Amitav's perspective, in a sense, is that we need a change of mindset. We need a profound change in our assumptions, our worldview, our culture. Malini seemed to me in some ways to respond by saying, well, hold on, actually, there is a shift in people's thinking. There is a shift in what is happening. There is change, and we need to talk about the fact that there is change happening now, as well as talking about the need for a radical shift. And the reason I found that so significant, I guess, is that it speaks to my own sense that the crisis that we face is so profound that we absolutely cannot do what the left all around the world is so deeply fond of doing, and that is wallowing. And I use the word wallowing in, it is in a profoundly self-indulgent process, but wallowing in the division between those who seek to drive progressive change now within the constraints of the system that we've got, but seeking to achieve change through incremental steps, but ultimately to a radically different end, and those who argue from a more revolutionary perspective, in a sense, that we can only achieve change, as Anne says, for example, by dismantling the global capitalist system. And it seems to me that the crisis is such that we have to do both. We have to maximize incremental change. We must want governments to make further progress at COP26. We must welcome genuine shifts in capitalist finance out of carbon, out of fossil fuels, the disinvestment movement. We must welcome these shifts at the same time as recognizing that ultimately a truly sustainable world will be profoundly different. And not only must we recognize the validity of both these projects, but we on the left, on the broad left, center left, must respect each other in this project. We must find a way of working in parallel on these different projects when, unfortunately, an enormous amount of the time, and this has been particularly acute since the global financial crisis, the left spends an enormous amount of time fighting between those in the project of making change now and those in the project of proposing radical change. We must do both, and we must do both respectfully and learning from each other.
And how do you feel about this? You ask for a global response, you ask for very radical reforms. I read your book with great joy and sympathy, I have to say, but how do we get there? I mean, what's the right approach, referring to what Matthew said?
Well, I need first of all to say that I'm not calling for the downfall of the global capitalist system. I'm calling for the downfall of a global market-based system. That is, we've elevated, markets have been with us for 5,000 years at least, at the very least, right? Societies everywhere have markets, but we've never lived in an era in which markets have lived beyond us, beyond the level of regulation and oversight by democracy. I'm a Keynesian, and Keynes understood that it was the international financial system that had led, for example, to the 1929 crisis. He understood that you had to transform the international financial system in order to create stability in Europe and stability in the West and in the whole world, actually. And the Bretton Woods Conference, convened in 1944 by Roosevelt, was a conference of countries from North and South, East and West. And they talked about developing a new system, which wasn't the end of, in fact, it protected capitalism, but it was a system which managed markets, really. And I mean, the inspiration I take is from Roosevelt. Roosevelt is elected, and I think, therefore, one of the things I feel strongly about is that we need political leadership. You know, there is a vacuum of leadership. Who wants to get involved in politics? Not me. You know, politics today is corrupted, it's discredited, it's divisive, it's awful. But in the 1930s, Roosevelt rose above all those divisions and exercised leadership. They were facing a massive climate crisis in the form of the Dust Bowl. By the way, the Dust Bowl caused by desertification, which America is now, you know, in force is repeating. You know, desertification is now going to be a function of the Great Plains of the United States. So they had this big climate crisis, plus they had a very big financial and unemployment crisis. And he also understood that the gold standard system, which was an international system, had to be transformed if the United States was to be able to increase employment and tackle climate. Now, you know, he did that by saying, sorry, but I'm bailing out of the gold standard. Of course, the United States is big and powerful and can do that. But China's big and powerful. India is big and powerful. You know, there are big and powerful states where if you had sound political leadership, you could challenge this international system. But I am convinced, as Keynes was in 1919, after the First World War, he was already convinced that we had to transform the international system, which allowed banks to determine really the key economic levers of economies and allow governments to do that if we wanted democracy. Now, how we do that, you know, that it's all very well for me to write theoretically about this. It is going to be very hard. But if we don't talk about it, if we don't have the ideas, if we don't have the debates, then out of those debates, there cannot arise the political leadership that we need, which is enlightened. And to use Matthew's point, which unites left and right, or the different wings of the left, or whatever. The point about Roosevelt was that he united his country. He brought everybody behind his project. And we need that kind of vision and leadership.
I would like to ask Malini, but I want to check if she's online again. I think she flew out for a while. Malini,
yeah, I can hear you.
Me? Super, that's great. Okay. So Malini, you work a lot with lawmakers and with well-established politicians. And I'm really curious to know what's your perspective on what Ann just said, you know, the self-perception of these leaders and basically the process of empowerment they would have to go through to really tackle these issues at the roots. What's your take on that?
Okay, and then if I can come back and just flesh out some of the other points, especially in terms of looking at the optic. In terms of political leadership, I think that there are parts of political leadership. I mean, everybody now wants to sit that Ardern to be their prime minister or president. Just want a massive in New Zealand. I think in Chile, with the political process, you are recognition.
Sorry, Malini, I think you're breaking up. We can't hear you properly. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so no, we'll try again in a minute. So maybe Matthew, I can ask you. You gave a talk this year where you basically spoke about the reflexive society, I think you called it, and you suggested that, you know, we may be entering a new era of social development. And considering what, you know, we can read in Amitav Ghosh's book, I was really curious to hear more about how you see the relationship between the development of society and the social development you spoke about, and our relationship to the ecosystem and the place of humanity within the whole, and how this is shifting within this shift you're talking about. Can you speak a little bit about this? That would be super.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult. We've got 4 minutes to go, and
yeah, I know.
It's a complex set of ideas that I'll be really. I'll try. I mean, look, I could come off the back of Ann's point, which is there have been times when the liberal democratic system has worked effectively, and the post-war era, looking back on it, is part of that. Now we have to recognise this was still a time when the West is achieving, partly as a consequence of the legacy of colonialism and the continuation of colonialism. But nevertheless, this is a time of relative economic, low levels of economic inequality, the growth of the welfare state, relative political consensus and social cohesion. And I think a big debate, which we're not going to be able to have now, that Amitav's book conjures up, but a lot of other conversation really, is whether or not the Western Enlightenment project is worth trying to save anymore. And I won't go into all the ways in which we have to recognize its compromised, its hypocrisies, its historical contingency, its arrogance. But nevertheless, for me, at the heart of the Enlightenment is a commitment to notions of universalism, of autonomy, and of humanism. And I still adhere to these notions. But it seems to me that what we forgot with the neoliberal turn, and it's not the first time we've forgotten it, because we forgot it in the 19th century as well, is we forgot how hard it is to balance these ideas. How do we have a society that balances notions of universalism and social justice with notions of autonomy and individual growth and expression, with the need for hierarchy, with the need for authority, for a need for institutions that enable society to solve problems? And this balance of markets, of civil society, of the state, we forget how hard it is. Now, if you get the balancing act right, you can make immense progress. And for me, if we're going to tackle climate change, we have to get that balance right again. We have to mobilize the power of hierarchy, authority, of markets and individual aspiration, but also of solidarity and social justice. And we have to bring those together. And what I meant by the concept of the age of reflexivity is that it seems to be that conversation, that macro conversation, has a parallel. And the parallel is in each individual human being, because each individual, each of us, is motivated by authority. We do what we're told. Each of us is motivated by belonging. We are part of tribes. And each of us is motivated by our own individual aspirations and tastes. And we too are in the project of trying to balance these things. And that what we've seen over the last 30 years in cognitive science is an enormous amount of insight into the kind of frailty of human character, of the ways in which, as Daniel Dennett once put it, we are traversing a modern world with a prehistorically evolved brain. And what I was trying to argue in the notion of the age of reflexivity is that is there a parallel between our need to understand ourselves better, to understand that we need authority, but yet we rebel against it, that we need to belong, but yet belonging can make us very tribal, that we want autonomy, but yet autonomy can fringe into a kind of narcissistic individualism, that being aware of our own individual psychological frailty can also connect us to the need to create a set of institutions that enable us to manage who we are as human subjects. And that it is that process of a deeper understanding of ourselves and a connection of that to the kind of institutions that we need that could enable us to recreate the balance Anne talked about, enable us to create the 21st version of that post-war settlement, of a society that recognizes the need to balance the power of markets and individual aspiration and the importance of solidarity and social justice in pursuit of a vision that leaders provide us, going back to Anne's point about politicians, that we trust leaders who tell us the things that we have to do if we're going to be able to get out of the crisis that we're in. So Sorry, it's taken me 4 minutes to compress that, but I hope it in some ways answers your question.
Well enough. It's big questions we're trying to tackle here. Well, I think one of the things I'm still chewing on, also after reading Amitav Ghosh's book, is that, you know, in times of the climate crisis, it feels that the ecosystem is coming back as an agent into the history of humankind, something which we pretended is not the case, arguably since Enlightenment. And this changes our perspective on ourselves as individuals and as humankind and human society, which I believe is a very deep and powerful and long-lasting transformation we're actually in right now. So we have a lot to chew on, and I'm really sorry that this session is already coming to an end. But all the more, I would like to very warmly thank you, Anne, and thank you, Matthew, for being here. And also thank you, Malini, in case you're still watching. I'm really sorry you had technical issues. So it was great to have you all. And I want to thank all of you who watched for being here, for staying with us tonight. Fill out the evaluation form to tell us how you found it and what we can improve. And I'm looking forward to seeing you back here again tomorrow night. And again, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Matthew. Have a very good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.